All right, welcome back. So now I want to look at the section of the Theaetetus from Stephanus numbers 187e to 200d. And this fairly lengthy section is a long digression that Socrates takes us on into the notion of error, trying to explain error, false judgments / beliefs. Remember, we're talking about doxa. We've identified the notion of episteme, knowledge, has something to do with doxa. But of course, doxa, true belief, judgment, comes in, doxa is belief and judgment, and you have, of course, two different kinds, right? You have true and false beliefs and judgments. So you can't identify episteme simply with doxa. You have to, as Theaetetus does, identify episteme with true belief and true judgment. But given that belief and judgment come in these two types, what does it mean to have a false judgment? What's going on here? So Socrates leads us along the garden path down towards these attempts, and there's 5 of them to try and figure out what false beliefs are about. Now, do we have to do this? Do we have to dig right in and go into the details of false beliefs and all that in order to understand the definition of knowledge, episteme, as true belief? No, we don't. It's not necessary. Why do they do it? What's the point of this? Well, remember the earlier digression, the one about philosophers and lawyers. Socrates says, I've been kind of curious since you bring up the notion of doxa, and I've been, thinking about this other thing about, just like he said earlier, when I've been worried about what knowledge is. And at this point in the dialogue, he said, I've always been kind of puzzled about what false judgments are. Now, this has a long tradition. I'm not going to go into it here, but there is a long tradition about how false judgments work, how negations work. So this is a kind of a specialist area of philosophy. It's long, and people have written tons of stuff on this. Socrates doesn't need to go in, but again, because we're philosophers and not lawyers, our time is not measured by the water clock. We can leisurely go into a problem, and that's what they all conclude. Yeah, we got the time. We're philosophers. Let's look into it. It's not necessary. You can think of it as a digression. But it's a good opportunity to see Socrates really digging into something. We've seen him do it before. We're going to see him do it again. All right. So, around 187... he says that belief or judgment we have seen. Oh, and by the way, all the attempts fail. So the belief, judgment, right, the whole thing about doxa, it's an activity of soul. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's an activity of soul. And we'll return to this notion of beliefs and judgments as the activity of soul. And what is it? The activity of soul when soul, is busy by itself about things that are. So thinking about the world, things that are, it's an activity of soul, and it's busy by itself. So it's internal. We'll see later on that Socrates thinks that thinking is like an internal dialogue, the soul talking to itself. And a nice image. All right, now, so as I said, 5 attempts, there they are. The 5, remember, the 5 and the 5 failed attempts what? To explain false beliefs, false judgments. We've got these 5, misidentification, so I've written them all out so you can find them. So misidentification, believing what is not, exchanging, and then 2 models of the mind, the wax analogy and the Avery analogy, or the wax model or Avery model, if you like. In this video, I'm going to look at attempts 1 and 2. So we'll call this part 1. And in other parts, I'll look at the other attempts. But for now, think of it part 1 of the 5 attempts. Here we're looking at attempts 1 and 2. Now, in attempt 1, which is our misidentification attempt, Socrates is going to propose a certain way of understanding what false judgments are. So remember, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to come up with some kind of theory, some explanation that responds to the question, what is going on when you have a false belief or a false judgment? It's not as easy as you think. It's not as easy and you can't repeat yourself. You can't just say, well, you're wrong. Well, how are you wrong? What does it mean to be wrong? Remember, when philosophers engage in this stuff, they're looking below the surface of everyday language. What do you mean when you say you got something wrong? If you think about, making mistakes in everyday life, there's a variety of ways you can make errors. So this is a very early discussion of error analysis. And if you've taken any courses in science, error analysis is a big thing. You have to understand how your equipment, whether it's your eyes or whether it's the equipment you're using, your scientific equipment to measure things, how it gets it right and how it gets it wrong. So you have to factor both of those into your analysis. Same thing. How do we get things wrong? All right. In this sense now, we've got this notion of the activity of soul. And in attempt 1, let's consider the following. Socrates brings in a few items here to sort of set this up, and we'll look at what this little chart means. For all things, Socrates says, and omitting, right? So we're gonna simplify a little bit. We're gonna omit coming to know or forgetting. So for now, omit coming to know and forgetting. So we're going to put that to the side. So what he's doing is trying to, as we often do when we're making up theories, constructing theories, you try and have a simplified version. No different in the sciences when a biologist studies a particular ecosystem. He or she doesn't study the whole Earth at once. They omit certain sections. Okay, I'm only studying this little region and I'm going to omit, so I'm going to simplify so I can get a handle on this. Same thing in this analysis. We're going to omit the notion of coming to know or forgetting. We're going to use a fairly strict dichotomy here, a fundamental restriction. We either know X or don't. Right? So we either know something or we don't know it. Right? So we're not going to talk about how we sort of partially know it through the process of coming to know, or partially know at decreasing amounts as we forget about it. No, we're simplifying again, right? We're not talking about the whole ocean, we're just talking about this one little island. We can get a handle sometimes on the island, you can build up. That's how the construction of knowledge works. You try and start with the simplest and move up. So we either we know or we don't. So if you know something, right, you cannot simultaneously not know it. Those are exclusive, mutually exclusive categories. If you know something, you cannot not know it, and if you don't know it, you can't simultaneously know it. So, in other words, those two categories are mutually exclusive. All right. So this, and not only is it just, haphazard or by accident, it's more or less a logical truth, right? If I know that something is the case, that the cup is on the table, it's logically impossible for me to say simultaneously that I don't know it. So you can't know and not know the same thing at the same time or simultaneously. That's logically impossible. You can't do those two together. All right. That's what we're going to put. These are presuppositions we're building in here. We'll look at them, at the presuppositions later, and ask, were those good ones? All right. Now, suppose we make a false judgment about X, right? Whatever X happens to be, it doesn't matter. It could be a cup or a soup spoon or a book or whatever. It doesn't really matter. And again, Socrates doesn't speak in terms of variables like this. I'm trying to pull the inner logic of his argument out. All right, so we make a false judgment and we say, okay, what is a false judgment? Well, in our case, we're going to talk about it as a misidentification, right? So when you make mistakes, you're just misidentifying things. That's really what's going on. So in that sense, to make a false judgment is to misidentify. To make a false judgment about X is to misidentify X with Y, right? So in that sense, what we're saying is that we misidentify and we say X is Y. Okay? That's the essence, really, of the false judgment in the notion of misidentification. So that's what we're trying to test. Does that really work? Is that a good explanation of false judgments, is misidentification? Well, we have our restriction. You either know it or you don't. So in this case now, we've got two variables, x and y. So that restriction applies to both. So we know x or we don't know x, and then by extension, we know y or we don't know y. When you have this dichotomy of knowing and not knowing, so that's our dichotomy, knowing, not knowing. All right, well, that's getting a little crowded on the board here, but okay, so we've got, in our first attempt, we've got a restriction. Our dichotomy is knowing, not knowing, right? They're mutually exclusive. We've omitted coming to know, forgetting. Okay? So we're taking a fairly straightforward notion of knowing. It's either there or not. It's all or nothing. Think of it that way, if you like. Well, if you have a misidentification, you've got x is y, or you could flip it, y is x. It doesn't really matter. But that's the problem. That is that false judgment is misidentification, saying x is y when x isn't y. So that's the locus of error. Now, does this work? Well, because of our restriction, you have this dichotomy, and because you've got two variables with this dichotomy, we make up this little chart. You have actually 4 possible cases when you have x is y. How to interpret it with this dichotomy. How is that? Well, you could both have it the case where you know x and you know y. So I've labeled this with a 1. You'll see why I've labeled them with numbers so we can keep track of them. So if you know both of them, you know x and you know y, we'll call that case 1. If you don't know, if you know neither of them, right? You don't know x, you don't know y, we'll call that case 2. And then case 3 and 4 is when you know one of them. In this case, you know x, but you don't know y. In this case, you know y, but you don't know x. So actually, there's really 3 cases if you think of it. You know both, you know neither, or you know one and not the other. Okay, so I labeled them, and I'll keep this numbering so you can follow along. Now, back to the Theaetetus text itself. Here's shall we say, a concrete way of looking at it. Instead of x's and y's, Socrates says, let's look at a concrete, so the dialogue looks at a concrete example where x is Theaetetus and y is Socrates. Well, let's run through these cases and see how it works. And so in case 1, x knows Theaetetus and Socrates, knows them both. Now, if you know both of them, right, you're saying that an error in making incorrect judgments is actually a kind of misidentification. But is this really possible? Think about it. Do you really want to make a misidentification as your explanation of forgetting when it leads you to say that you're going to know both of them and say that one is the other? Could you really do that? Would you be capable of this? Right? Socrates says, this seems kind of absurd that you're going to make that kind of mistake. If you know both of them, how would you say that they are the same? They're different. They're different people. One's Theaetetus and one is Socrates. Would you be capable of this? Could you know both and then still make that judgment that Theaetetus is Socrates? Could you know 2 things and still say that one is the other, and at the same time knowing this? So to say that Theaetetus is Socrates, this seems to be absurd if you know both Theaetetus and Socrates. So this notion of misidentification seems to founder on this whole notion. Remember, with all these things considered, to say that seems to make no sense. How about this one? If you say Theaetetus is Socrates in this second one, and you don't know either of them, how could you make judgments about things you don't know about at all? There'd be lots of things you don't know at all. How could you make that judgment again? Well, it seems Socrates says you couldn't make that judgment if you don't know either of them. So in both of these, in case 1 and case 2, if you know them both, you can't make a false judgment like Theaetetus is Socrates. You couldn't make it because You know they're different, so you couldn't think they're the same thing. And if you know nothing about them, how could you think two things you know nothing about are the same? In other words, how can you think about something you know nothing about in any which way? And that is going to lead us into this one here and this one here as well. If you don't know anything about something, how can you really think about it? What sense does that make? If I say, think about something you know nothing about, that's a weird sort of command. First thing you would say is, well, what are you talking about? And I'd say, I'm not going to tell you. I just want you to think about something that you don't know anything about and compare it to something or contrast it with something. You'd say, I can't do that. So in the same thing, in this one, you can't do it. Same thing in here and here. To make this misidentification, in all of these cases, it doesn't seem possible to be able to do that. So if you do make these kinds of judgments, when you are making mistakes, okay, let's not lose the forest for the trees here. What you're trying to do is explain how you can make a false judgment. You've made the false judgment, like Theaetetus is Socrates. Could you make it if this is your explanation of false judgments? And it seems that the answer is, no, you couldn't make mistakes if that's your explanation of false judgments. So we do make mistakes. Like, remember, we make all kinds of mistakes. People might do this all the time, make these kinds of misidentification. Right? We might do that. But this doesn't explain how we can do this. So the problem ultimately is that this explanation would seem to rule out the possibility of making mistaken judgments. But we make mistaken judgments. We make errors all the time. So in that sense, attempt 1 is not going to work. It sounded good at first that it's just misidentification, but if you dig more deeply into the notion of misidentification, it seems to eliminate the possibility of making mistakes. But that's absurd. We make mistakes. So you can't have an error analysis, right? I'm going to investigate. Imagine if you did that in science. I'm going to investigate how our machines can go awry when we measure things. And then when you do your analysis, you say, hey, guess what? The machine never makes a mistake. You say, okay, you've done something wrong and you've presupposed some things or whatever. We got to try another kind of analysis. Something went awry here. So same thing here. Attempt 1, misidentification, fails. So Socrates says, okay, let's try another one. We're going to introduce some other background, a little bit of background, and we'll see if that works. Attempt 2. All right. So we could say goodbye, failed. That gets an F on the report card. In attempt number 2, we have a false belief is believing, judging what is not. Okay. All right. So in our first one, it seemed that the theory would lead us to say there's no way we can make false judgments, but we make false judgments. This one here is going to say, okay, let's try a different way to explain how we make false judgments. And here Socrates says it's not misidentifying one thing another, but when you make a false judgment, what you're really doing is you're judging something, and that thing doesn't actually exist. So a false judgment or belief, so J and B, false judgment or belief is to judge or believe an X, right? May believe something, an X, or believe or judge something about an X, or I should say, but X does not exist. So you're judging what is not. All right. So in other words, you're believing nothing or judging nothing. So, or a belief about or a judgment about nothing. What exactly does that really mean? Socrates says, okay, so we've got a different dichotomy instead of the knowing, not knowing. So just to think about this, your dichotomy, instead of, in this one, remember, it was knowing, not knowing. In this one, it is being, not being. Or if you want a little less fancy terminology, existing or not existing. All right. Socrates, remember, we saw this, there was a relationship between the notion of this earlier discussion that we have about the senses, they bring in or they allow in, there's this passive aspect to them. They bring in sort of this natural perceptions. And then belief and judgment, it's an activity of soul when it's busy about things that are. That's going to give you a little hint as what's coming. Things that are, and we've already said this is a thing that isn't. And again, you might think if you're really thinking about this, it's kind of odd to talk about a thing that isn't. If I say like a unicorn isn't, right? What am I referring to, right? That's an odd one. So that in the history of philosophy is known as the problem of negative existentials. And there's a voluminous amount of literature on this. We make negative existential statements all the time, like unicorns don't exist. What are you referring to when you say the unicorn in the statement, the unicorn does not exist, right? So this has been, clearly those sentences are sensible. A unicorn does not exist, dragons don't exist. We make statements like that all the time. We're not puzzled by them until philosophers run in and say, how do you think that really works? How do you think the sentence actually works in terms of its reference? Like, what are you referring to when you talk about dragons and you say they don't exist? Or round squares don't exist. So this is an old problem. We see it in the Theaetetus, and as I said, it's an absolute cottage industry to try and explain how this part of language works. All right, you put that aside for a second, dig in on that at another time. It's quite fascinating. But here, remember, we started talking about the activity of soul with belief and judgment, about things that are, and Socrates draws an analogy. So we see reasoning, philosophical reasoning again, in action. He says something like this. Suppose we see something that isn't, right? We see, like an X that is not, right? And I'm talking about see not in any fancy way. I'm talking about just like visual, right? And so I'm not putting it in scare quotes. I'm using see in the plain old garden variety sense of that term. You see an X that is not. Can you actually see nothing? Right? So in other words, X does not exist. Right? We often say, there's an old joke from Lewis Carroll where, people say things like, well, I see nobody is here. And other people will say, that's amazing. I've always wondered what nobody looks like, right? So there are little funny aspects of grammar and the way we use language. But if you say something like, we see an X, or you see that nobody is here, you're not really saying you're seeing a non-existent person. I'm not saying anything like that, although it sounds like you are in a way. But what Socrates says is, if you say we see an X that is not, how should we understand this? Not that you're seeing, so not that we see a, whoops, let's put this, let me be very clear here. Not. All right, so not that we see a non-existent X. You can't see a non-existent X, right? Rather, and here's where it just is just sort of cleaning up the language. When you really say that you see nobody is here, you're saying you're really not seeing. You're not seeing in the sense of you're not seeing anything. Or, as Socrates says, if you talk about seeing an X that is not, you're not really seeing at all. In other words, seeing isn't happening, right? So same thing with judging. If you say you're judging about something that doesn't exist, there really isn't a judging at all. So that's the explanation. When you make mistakes, really what's going on is you're ultimately, well, to complete the analogy, so by analogy, to so an error is really, let's keep this, to judge or believe a non-existent, but believing a non-existent is a lot like seeing a non-existent, which means not really seeing at all. So judging or believing a non-existent is not to judge or believe at all. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, in the sense that is the first one in the misidentification, it failed because it said that it ran into problems with trying to explain how we make these errors, and it said that ultimately we can't make those errors, but we do. This one here fails in a similar way by trying to explain false judgments and beliefs by reference to this dichotomy, and it ends up saying that false judging and believing is ultimately not to judge or believe at all. So you go from this here down to here. And what's the problem? Well, what do you mean that judging and believing? Like if I say the unicorn doesn't exist, or I believe in unicorns, right? That's still a belief, isn't it? It's a false belief, but it's still a belief. If I believe the cup is on the table, that's a true belief. Or how about this? I hold my cup up and I say, right now, I believe that cup is on the table. That's a false belief. Likewise, as I'm saying, I believe the cup is on the table, I'm also telling you I believe, sorry for the Unicorn Society, I believe in unicorns. That's also a false belief. But it would seem to say that when I make those statements about false beliefs, I'm not really believing at all. That seems absurd. So why is this absurd? Remember, what we do have false judgments and beliefs all the time. So once again, the explanation seems to eradicate the possibility of something that we agree that we do. We make mistakes all the time. We're actually making false judgments. We're not doing nothing. We're making, or how about this? You can think of it like this, that if someone said, oh, you know what, when you make mistakes in judgment, those are you think you're judging, but that's an illusion. You'd say, no, I made a mistake. You have to be honest about this. You made a mistake. You had a mistake in belief, a mistake in judgment. You were wrong about something. That's fine. But you weren't not judging at all. So this one, number 2, believing what is not, with our different dichotomy, right? Knowing, not knowing, believing, not knowing. This one gets an F as well. Failed, doesn't work. This is, again, we have 2 attempts, 2 rationally governed attempts. Now remember, the attempts are themselves, because they're rationally governed, they're not just all over the place. There's presuppositions built in and a little bit of logic. So it's not freewheeling and anything goes. But if we end up with 2 situations here now of both failing to explain what false beliefs are by simply, in some way, both of them are similar in that they sort of jettison the whole notion of false belief. In other words, the cure is arguably worse than the disease, right? If someone says, well, I've got an explanation, false beliefs don't exist, or it's not really a judgment, you'd say, oh, that's not going to work. That's worse than what I started with. But this gives you a bit of a flavor of the real problems when you start digging into how we get things wrong. Now, again, this isn't absolutely necessary for Socrates to continue the conversation about true belief as a possible definition of knowledge, but it certainly shows you that trying to figure out what a false belief is, trying to explain how you get things wrong or what it means to get things wrong, is not exactly a self-evident enterprise. So what comes now? Well, tries it again in the third attempt, and that's exchanging. We'll check that out next video.